Every person who fails to achieve their highest goals shares the exact same fatal flaw. They believe that focus is a muscle you must flex until your mind begins to bleed. Rui sat cross-legged on the cold cedar planks of the Iron Willow dojo, his knuckles white. His jaw locked so tightly that his teeth ground against one another. For 3 hours, he had been staring at a single black ink dot painted on a rice paper screen across the room. He told himself that if he looked away, if his mind drifted even an inch toward the heat of the afternoon or the dull ache in his lower back, he had failed. He was using every ounce of his soul to force his eyes to stay fixed. Yet, the harder he clamped down on his thoughts, the faster they rushed away from him like water slipping through a clenched fist. His breath was shallow, his shoulders were knots of tension, and his vision was beginning to blur into a gray haze. He was completely exhausted, not from moving, but from the brutal internal war of trying to make himself look at something he did not want to see. Most people believe that deep concentration requires this kind of violence against the self. Rui discovered that everything changes the moment you stop fighting the storm and instead remove the sails that catch the wind. What happened next in the mountain fog rewrote everything he thought he knew about the nature of a warrior's mind. The door to the dojo slid open with a soft, deliberate rasp. Master Kael stepped into the room, his blind eyes clouded like milk, his wooden staff tapping rhythmically against the floorboards. Beside him walked Ren, his posture flawless, his expression as unmoving as a stone wall. Ren did not look exhausted. He looked precise. He took his place on the mat without a sound, his eyes immediately locking onto his own mark on the screen. Rui felt a sharp prickle of resentment in his chest. Why was it so effortless for Ren? Why did Ren possess the mythical grit that Rui had to claw and bleed for every single morning? Rui drew in a sharp, ragged breath, trying to force his mind back to the dot, trying to scream at his own brain to sit still. Master Kael stopped tapping his staff. He stood between the two young men, listening to the erratic, heavy rhythm of Rui's breathing and the silent, cold stillness of Ren's frame. The old master did not offer a word of praise, nor did he offer a lecture on Zen. Instead, he reached out with his wooden staff and struck the floorboards between them with a sudden, deafening crack. Rui jumped, his heart leaping into his throat, his eyes darting to the staff. Ren remained perfectly still, though a small bead of sweat rolled down the side of his neck. Master Kael smiled, a faint, knowing curve of his lips. He leaned over his staff and asked a single question that hung in the quiet air like smoke. "Tell me, Rui, if a man wishes to keep a fire burning through a gale, does he stand over the flames screaming at the wind to stop blowing?" Rui rubbed his temples, the throbbing pain behind his eyes growing more intense by the second. "Master, I am doing exactly what you told me to do," Rui said, his voice raw with frustration. "I have not broken my gaze from that mark since the sun was over the eastern ridge. I am forcing every thought out of my head. I am fighting every distraction that enters this room. If my mind wanders, I pull it back by force. Is that not what discipline is? Is that not what it means to have the spirit of a warrior?" Master Kael did not answer immediately. He turned his face toward Ren. "And you, Ren? How do you maintain your seat while the world moves around you?" Ren's voice was clipped, clean, and devoid of doubt. "I do not fight the distractions, Master. I build a wall within my mind. I make myself a fortress of iron. No matter what noise enters the courtyard, no matter how hot the sun becomes, I repeat my forms in my head. I hold my position, because my will is stronger than the environment around me." Master Kael nodded slowly, his milk-white eyes turning back toward the open doorway, where the mountain breeze was beginning to pick up, carrying the scent of pine and oncoming rain. "A fortress of iron is magnificent to look upon," Ren, the master, murmured. "But when the earth beneath it begins to shake, iron does not bend. It shatters." You both believe that focus is an act of war. You believe that by swinging the sword of your will, you can conquer your own nature. Rui looked down at his calloused hands, his mind spinning with confusion. "If it is not a war, Master, then why does it feel like a battle every single second? Why does my mind want to look at everything except the task before me? Why do I feel so weak when I try to do what is right?" Master Kael tapped his staff twice on the floor, signaling them both to stand. "We are leaving the dojo," the old man said simply. "Collect your wooden practice swords. We go to the high gorge of the Black River." Rui felt a wave of relief wash over him just at the prospect of leaving the room, but it was quickly replaced by a cold knot of anxiety. The high gorge was a treacherous place, a narrow path of slick slate hanging hundreds of feet above a roaring torrent of white water. It was a place where a single misstep meant death, a place that demanded absolute, flawless concentration. Why would Kael take them there, when Rui's mind was already frayed and exhausted? As they walked out into the courtyard, Ren moved with his usual mechanical efficiency, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his wooden blade. Rui followed, his legs feeling heavy, his mind still buzzing with the residual static of his morning frustration. He tried to tell himself to prepare, to harden his heart, to force his focus into a sharp edge before they reached the cliffs. He believed that if he just tried harder, if he pulled his thoughts together with enough brute strength, he would be safe. He did not realize that the trap had already been set, and his own willpower was the bait. The path grew steeper as they climbed, the smooth gravel of the valley giving way to jagged gray rocks and roots that clawed through the thin dirt like ancient fingers. The wind here was different. It did not blow in a steady stream, but came in violent, unpredictable gusts that rattled the trees and tore the leaves from their branches. The roar of the Black River rose from below, a deep, bass vibration that resonated in the bones of Rui's chest. It was a chaotic environment, an assault on every sense. Master Kael walked at the front, his pace unhurried, his wooden staff finding the stable ground with uncanny precision despite his blindness. He did not look like a man who was forcing himself to walk straight. He looked like a stone rolling down a groove it had traveled for 1,000 years. When they reached the mouth of the gorge, the path narrowed until it was barely wide enough for two men to stand abreast. On their left was a sheer wall of black slate, dripping with wet moss. On their right was nothing but a drop into the roaring white mist. Master Kael stopped and turned to face them. He drew his wooden sword with a slow, fluid motion that lacked any tension. "This is your training ground for the afternoon," the master said, his voice easily cutting through the roar of the water below. "You will face each other in a duel of 3 strikes. But you will not fight on the path, you will fight on the logs." Rui looked past the master and felt his stomach drop. Spanning across a 30-foot gap in the gorge were 3 ancient logs, bound together by rotting hemp ropes. They were soaked by the spray of the river, green with algae, and suspended directly over the deepest part of the chasm. The wind screamed through the gap, making the wooden bridge sway and groan against its rock anchors. To stand on those logs required balance. To fight on them seemed completely insane. Ren did not hesitate. He stepped forward, his face a mask of absolute resolve. "I am ready, Master," he said, his voice steady. He stepped onto the wet timber, his bare feet gripping the bark, his wooden sword held in a perfect middle guard. He looked like a statue, completely unaffected by the roaring void beneath him. Master Kael turned his blind head toward Rui. "Your turn, apprentice." Rui felt his knees tremble. His mind immediately flooded with 100 terrifying thoughts. What if the rope breaks? What if my foot slips on the moss? What if Ren strikes too hard? He tried to use his old method. He slammed his mental jaws shut, trying to force the fear out of his head, trying to command his eyes to see nothing but Ren's chest. He stepped onto the log. The wood rolled slightly under his weight, and a violent gust of wind hit his left shoulder. Rui's vision swam. He had to drop into a deep, ugly stance just to keep from falling, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his sword. The contrast between the two apprentices was stark. Ren stood like an iron pillar, his focus forced into a tight technical knot through sheer determination. Rui was a trembling wire, his mind screaming at him to run, his willpower entirely consumed by the effort of not looking down at the white water below. Master Kael stood on the solid rock of the path, his hands resting on the pommel of his staff. "Begin," the old man commanded. Ren moved instantly. He did not rush, but his forward step was fast and clean, his wooden sword descending in a sharp, vertical arc, aimed directly at Rui's shoulder. Rui saw the blow coming, but his mind was so busy trying to manage his fear and keep his feet glued to the log that his reaction was slow. He brought his sword up in a clumsy parry. The impact of the wood sent a shockwave up his arms, shifting his center of gravity. His right foot slipped an inch on the wet algae. Panic, sharp and hot, spiked through his brain. Rui dropped his sword completely, throwing his arms out to balance himself, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He managed to regain his footing, but he was panting, his eyes wide, his body completely paralyzed by the realization of how close he had come to the edge. Ren stood 3 paces away, his sword returned to its guard, his chest rising and falling in a slow rhythmic pattern. "Your focus is broken, Rui," Ren said, his voice tight with a subtle edge of superiority. "You are letting the river into your mind. You must lock it out, as I do." Rui did not answer. He was too busy trying to breathe, trying to find that mythical internal strength that Ren seemed to possess in abundance. He picked up his wooden sword, his hands slick with sweat despite the cold mountain air. He told himself that he would not fail again. He would be like Ren. He would build the Iron Fortress. He stared at Ren's throat, trying to use the absolute weight of his will to erase the sound of the water, the feel of the wind, and the slipperiness of the logs. Master Kael watched them, or rather, he listened to them. He listened to the rigid, brittle tension in Ren's muscles and the chaotic, desperate energy in Rui's blood. "Second strike," the master called out. This time, Rui decided to attack first. He could not stand still and wait for his mind to rot. He lunged forward, swinging his blade in a wide horizontal slash. It was a blow born of desperation, not technique. Ren saw it coming from a mile away. He simply stepped back 1 pace, allowing Rui's sword to cut through empty air. The momentum of the missed swing pulled Rui forward, his weight shifting too far onto his front foot. He tried to force his body to stop, to command his muscles to hold their ground through sheer effort, but physics did not care about his willpower. He stumbled, his foot leaving the log entirely. He fell forward, his chest slamming hard against the wet timber, his legs dangling into the empty air above the gorge. For a terrifying second, Rui hung there, his fingers clawing at the rough bark of the log, his wooden sword clattering down into the abyss below. The sound of it hitting the rocks hundreds of feet down was swallowed by the roar of the water. He hauled himself back up onto the log, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps, his skin scraped and bleeding where it had hit the wood. He sat astride the log, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold on to the bark. He had failed completely. He had used every ounce of his mental strength, every scrap of his discipline, and it had blown up in his face. He looked across at Ren, expecting to see a look of contempt, but what he saw instead surprised him. Ren was still standing, but his posture was no longer perfect. His shoulders were high. His knuckles were purple from how tightly he was gripping his sword, and his breath was coming faster now. The constant effort of holding back the environment through sheer willpower was starting to drain his battery too. The iron fortress was beginning to show cracks under the relentless pressure of the wind and the roar of the chasm. Master Kael stepped onto the first log, his movements so light he did not even cause the timber to sway. He walked until he stood just behind Ren. "Rui," the master said, his voice calm and clear above the chaos. "Look at your companion. What do you see?" Rui looked up, his vision clearing as his adrenaline began to recede. I see that he is still standing, Master," Rui whispered, his throat dry. "He is stronger than me. He has the discipline I lack." Master Kael chuckled, a soft, dry sound that was carried away by the gale. "No, Rui, you see a man who is spending all his gold to buy a single hour of peace. Ren is not focused. He is resisting. He is using his will to fight the river, to fight the wind, to fight his own fear of falling. And because he is fighting everything, he has nothing left for the sword. Watch what happens when I change the prompt." Master Kael did not strike Ren with his sword. He did not push him. He simply reached out with his foot and gently tapped the side of Ren's heel, shifting his foot just 2 inches to the left, into a patch of smooth green moss that Ren had been carefully avoiding. It was a tiny change, a microscopic adjustment to his physical environment. Ren's eyes went wide. The sudden, unexpected shift broke the rigid mental script he had been running in his head. The internal wall he had built shattered instantly. He did not have the flexibility to adapt because his focus was based on total resistance, not design. Ren gasped, his arms windmilling as his balance evaporated. He lost his grip on his sword, and his legs went out from under him. He fell backward, his body slipping off the log entirely. If Master Kael had not been there, Ren would have followed Rui's sword into the black depths of the gorge. But the old man's movement was faster than sight. His staff shot out, the curved handle catching the fabric of Ren's belt, pinning him to the log just as his torso cleared the wood. Ren hung there for a long moment, staring down into the white teeth of the river, his face completely pale, his legendary composure entirely gone. Master Kael hauled him back onto the timber with a single, effortless pull of his arm. Ren collapsed next to Rui, both of them trembling, both of them defeated, sitting on an ancient log in the middle of a mountain storm. The silence that fell between them was heavier than the roar of the water below. They had both tried to use their minds to conquer the world, and the world had broken them both in less than 10 minutes. Master Kael sat down between them on the log, crossing his legs as if he were sitting on the soft grass of a valley meadow. He did not look at them with his blind eyes. He looked out into the mist. "You see, my children," the old man said, his voice dropping into a register of profound clarity. "You both believe that focus is something you do. You think it is an action, an effort, an output of energy. It is not. Focus is the absence of friction. It is the result of an environment that leaves your mind with nowhere else to go." Rui wiped the sweat and river spray from his eyes, his mind suddenly feeling strangely empty, stripped of the manic anxiety that had possessed him all morning. "I do not understand, Master," he said, his voice quiet. "How can focus be an environment? We cannot control the wind. We cannot stop the river from roaring. We cannot make the logs less slippery. The world is chaotic. If we do not use our will to fight it, how do we survive?" Master Kael reached out and touched the rough bark of the log beneath them. "You cannot control the river, Rui, but you can control where you place your feet before the fight begins. When you were in the dojo this morning, you were staring at a black dot on a white screen. Why did your mind wander? It wandered because the room was full of choices. Your mind could think about the heat. It could think about the pain in your back. It could think about your lunch. It could think about Ren. You were using your willpower to say no to 1,000 different paths. Willpower is a limited coin, Rui. By the time you had said no to 900 distractions, your purse was empty, and the last 100 took your mind away. Unbreakable focus is not about having the strength to say no to 1,000 things. It is about designing a life where those 1,000 things never ask the question in the first place. Ren looked down at his scraped hands, his breath slowly returning to normal, though his voice still carried the tremor of his near-death experience. "How do we do that here, Master?" he asked, his pride entirely gone. "How do we design an environment on a slippery log in a gorge?" Master Kael stood up, balance returning to him like a natural law. "Look at how you stood, Ren. You stood in a rigid middle guard, your feet wide, trying to hold a textbook stance that was designed for the flat dirt of a battlefield. You forced your body to adapt to a script, rather than adapting your environment to your body. Watch." Master Kael turned his body sideways, aligning his feet perfectly along the center ridge of the log, where the bark was thickest and least slippery. He tucked his arms close to his chest, lowering his center of gravity until he was almost kneeling, reducing the surface area that the wind could strike. He did not fight the wind, he let it pass over him. He did not look at a distant dot. He looked only at the exact point where his toe met the wood. He narrowed his world until there was only one possible path for his attention to travel. He had removed every choice, every alternative, every bit of friction between his mind and the timber. He was not using willpower to focus. He had designed a position where distraction was physically impossible. The two apprentices sat in silence, watching the blind old man stand perfectly still on a wet log in a mountain gale. The lesson was sinking into Rui's mind like ink into clean water. He realized that his entire life had been an attempt to force his mind through environments that were designed for failure. He studied late into the night in a room filled with books and distractions, then wondered why his eyes drifted. He tried to practice his forms while his mind was cluttered with worries about the future, then wondered why his technique was sloppy. He was trying to be an iron fortress in a swamp. True samurai discipline, the master continued, stepping back onto the solid ground of the cliff path, is the art of strategic subtraction. If you wish to master your mind, you must first master the space your mind inhabits. You must remove the triggers that lead to temptation. You must automate the decisions that drain your energy. You must make the right path the easiest path, and the wrong path an impossibility. If you rely on your grit to carry you through an environment of chaos, you will fail the moment your body becomes tired or your heart becomes heavy. Master Kael walked back down the path toward the valley, his wooden staff tapping a steady, unhurried rhythm against the stone. Ren stood up slowly, his movements no longer mechanical or rigid, but careful and deliberate. He turned to Rui and held out his hand, helping his companion up from the wet timber. For the first time since they had met, there was no rivalry in Ren's eyes. There was only a shared understanding of their own fragility. They stepped off the logs together, leaving the roaring chaos of the gorge behind them, but carrying its lesson deep within their bones. They understood now that the path to unbreakable focus did not lie in the violence of the spirit, but in the wisdom of preparation. When they returned to the Iron Willow Dojo that evening, the sun was setting behind the western peaks, casting long, crimson shadows across the cedar floorboards. The dojo was cold, quiet, and completely empty. Rui did not sit down on his mat immediately. Instead, he went to the corner of the room and began to move the screens. He shifted them until they blocked out the view of the courtyard, where the other students were laughing and talking. He moved his training mat so that it faced a blank slate wall, away from the drafts and the noise of the kitchen. He did not try to harden his mind, he simplified his world. Rui sat down, crossed his legs, and closed his eyes. He did not force his breath, he simply let the silence of the room settle over him like a warm blanket. Without the constant noise of choices, without the friction of a dozen competing prompts, his mind dropped into a state of deep, effortless clarity. He did not need willpower anymore. He had designed his peace. If you are still trying to force your life into order through sheer mental violence, stop fighting the river. Look at the space around you. Look at the habits you have built. And look at the choices you allow into your day. True strength is not found in the iron wall that resists the storm, but in the hand that removes the sails before the wind can tear them apart. Comment below, what is the single biggest distraction in your daily environment that you need to remove today? Subscribe